The car stopped in front of a large house. A man turned to his daughter and said, "Get out! I want to show you something." The young woman got out and followed her father. They entered the estate, and she was astonished by its beauty. They walked through a large garden that hid the house from view. The man opened the door, and the young woman stepped inside, halting to take in its elegant decor. Her eyes had never seen such masterpieces. She turned to her father and asked, "Whose home is this?" Her father replied, "It's ours." "Ours?" the young woman questioned. "Yes, you heard right," the man said, adding, "Henceforth we will live here." "But how are you able to buy it?" the young woman asked. "I made a profit from the last deal and decided to buy this house with the money," her father explained. "This big house needs some employees," the young woman remarked. "Well, tomorrow I will advertise in the newspaper," the man said. "Can I choose the workers from the applicants?" his daughter asked. "Of course you can," the man replied. The advertisement was published in the newspaper, and applicants sent their resumes. The young woman began to read them. Among them, one resume caught her attention. She turned to her father and said, "Dad, this resume belongs to a nurse. I think we need her." "A nurse? My dear, we need a maid, not a nurse. Unless you think your father has Alzheimer's and needs a nurse," the man responded. "I want to interview her," his daughter insisted. "As you wish, my dear," the father said. The young woman selected 6 resumes from the numerous applications and arranged interviews with them. On the interview day, she met the nurse first because she was very curious about her. "It says here that you worked as a nurse. Why did you quit your job? Why aren't you looking for a job in nursing?" the young woman asked. "I was laid off and tried hard to find another job but couldn't. I have a 7-year-old child to feed and rent to pay, and I'm currently jobless," the former nurse responded. "Who is taking care of your child? If I hire you, who will look after your child?" the young woman asked. "My mother," the former nurse replied. "Very well, you can start your job tomorrow," the young woman said. The nurse got up cheerfully and headed toward the door. The young woman added, "I'm sorry to ask, but you don't have a husband?" The nurse turned, gave a strange look and said, "My husband died a month after our marriage." Then she left the room. The young woman interviewed the other applicants carefully. When all the applicants had left, her father, who had been quietly observing, rose and went to the window. "I feel like I've seen the nurse somewhere before, but I can't remember where. Her face is so familiar," he said. "Perhaps at a hospital." "She was a nurse before," the young woman suggested. 4 applicants were chosen. 2 maids, the former nurse, and a cook. Months passed, and everything was going smoothly until one night the man heard wails. He got out of bed and followed the sound, which led to his daughter's room. He opened the door slowly, and the wails stopped. He entered and saw his daughter in a deep sleep. Shutting the door, he returned to his room. The next morning, while they were eating breakfast, the father said, "I think you had a nightmare last night." "Me? Why do you think that?" his daughter asked. "Because I heard frightening noises coming from your room," her father replied. "I didn't have any horror dreams last night," the young woman said. The man didn't pursue the topic further. Several nights passed. The man returned home close to midnight. All the lights were off, and the inhabitants of the house were asleep. He entered quietly, heading straight to his room. As he passed his daughter's room, he suddenly stopped and turned back, straining to listen. There was no sound. He continued to his room, changed his clothes, then went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of liqueur, and returned to his room. Placing the glass on a small table beside his bed, he moved to turn off the light switch when he heard his daughter calling him. "Dad! Dad! Please come here! Help me, Dad!" Her voice echoed from the garden. The man rushed out of his room and dashed to the garden, searching frantically but finding no trace of his daughter. He returned to the house and noticed the light in his daughter's room was on. Quietly he entered, finding the room dark and his daughter asleep in her bed. Carefully watching over her, he gently closed the door and returned to his room, staring at the untouched glass of liqueur. "I must quit this drinking habit," he muttered to himself. The next day he avoided mentioning the previous night's events to his daughter. Days passed, and everything seemed to settle down. The man gradually began to forget about the incidents. During a meeting, the secretary approached him, whispering, "Sir, your business partner called. He wants to speak with you, but your cell phone is off. He asked me to remind you to turn it on." "Very well," the man replied. He switched on his phone and immediately received a message. "Your daughter, be careful." The number was restricted. On his way home from work, he read the message several times, each time asking himself, who sent this and why? It was midnight when another message arrived. He jumped up, turned on the light, and grabbed his phone. "Your daughter, you don't have much time." He hurried to his daughter's room, only to find her fast asleep. Returning to his room, he paced anxiously, sitting on his bed with his head in his hands. As dawn approached, he heard a woman groaning in the hallway. He rushed out of his room, but found no one. Returning, he heard the groaning again, this time from the garden. He opened the window and peered out, seeing no one there. Stepping outside, he spotted his daughter walking toward the garden. He followed, finding her standing near a tree, staring into the distance. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" he asked gently. She remained silent, staring ahead. "It's cold. Let's go inside," he suggested, taking her hand and leading her back to the house. As he held her hand, he noticed she was running a fever. He decided to stay home from work that day to care for her. That night, as he sat beside her bed, the door opened slowly. The nurse entered quietly and approached him. "Sir, you must be exhausted. Go to your room and rest. I'll watch over her," the nurse said kindly. "Thank you," the man replied with a tired smile. He got up and left the room. Later that night, as he pretended to sleep in his room, he heard the door creak open softly. Keeping his eyes closed, he listened as the door closed again, followed by his daughter's voice whispering, "Dad, Dad, please help me." He leaped out of bed and followed the voice, which led him to the bathroom. Opening the door, he found his daughter submerged in the bathtub. Shocked, he shouted for help, and all the household staff rushed upstairs. Spotting the nurse, he grabbed her arms in a panic. "Why did you drown my daughter?" he demanded, shaking with fear. "Your daughter is in her bed, sir," the nurse replied calmly. "If my daughter is in her bed, then who is in the bathtub?" the man asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Who is in the bathtub if my daughter is in her bed?" the man questioned, his voice trembling. All the employees peered into the bathroom and replied, "Sir, there is nobody here." The man looked again, finding neither his daughter nor even water in the tub. "Sir, you need to rest," the former nurse insisted gently. Reluctantly, the man returned to his daughter's room. She slept peacefully, just as the nurse had said. He returned to his room and lay on his bed, closing his eyes. The next morning, the former nurse called urgently. "Sir, sir!" He opened his eyes tiredly. "What is it?" "Sir, your daughter has a high fever. I can't manage it here. She needs to be transferred to a hospital. Immediately, the man sprang into action. Call an ambulance. I already have, the nurse replied. I'm coming now, the man said. He quickly changed and hurried to his daughter's room. They transferred her to the hospital, where the man stayed by her side all day and into the night. Exhausted, he returned home late, collapsing into bed and falling asleep instantly. In the middle of the night, his phone rang. It was his daughter. Dad, please, I want to come home. I can't stay here a minute longer. Come and get me, or I'll come back myself, she pleaded. You have to stay there, the man insisted, but the call ended abruptly. He dressed hastily and raced to the hospital. As he approached, he saw a figure resembling his daughter running across the road. He parked and rushed after her, but a speeding car struck him, and he died instantly. 2 weeks passed since the man's death. The young woman sat by the fireplace, holding her father's picture, lost in sadness. The household staff were asleep when one of the maids suddenly felt a presence in her room. She turned on the light, finding no one there. The door was locked. She returned to bed but felt hands on her toes, screaming and rushing to open the door. The young woman appeared, concerned. What happened? Why are you shaking? Somebody was in my room, the maid exclaimed. The young woman entered the room, inspected it, and found nothing. You might have had a nightmare, the cook suggested. No, I was awake. I felt 2 hands on my toes, the maid insisted. Perhaps someone was playing a prank, the former nurse offered. How could someone enter when the door was locked? The maid questioned nervously. Are you sure it was locked? The cook asked. Yes, I lock it every night before bed, the maid affirmed, unnerving everyone. Please, give her something to help her relax, the young woman instructed the nurse before dismissing the staff back to their rooms. The next night, after dinner, the young woman changed and prepared to leave the house. The cook noticed her and asked, Miss, are you going somewhere? Yes, she replied with a solemn tone. She retrieved a vase of flowers from the kitchen. Could you bring these flowers? The cook returned with the vase. Where should I put them? Nowhere. I just needed the flowers. Put the vase back, the young woman said quietly. The flowers? The cook questioned, surprised. I want to put them on my father's grave, the young woman replied solemnly, opening the door and departing. As the cook returned to the kitchen, she muttered to herself, The young lady's behaviour is bizarre. The other domestics, who were having dinner, turned to her in curiosity. What has she done? One of the maids asked. She went to the cemetery at this time of night, the cook exclaimed. The cemetery? The domestics echoed in disbelief. Yes, you heard correctly, the cemetery, the cook confirmed, shaking her head. This place is strange. Every night I hear someone walking and wailing, the former nurse remarked with a shiver. One of the maids turned to her, saying, Yes, I felt someone touch my toes last night. When I ran out of my room, the young lady was standing there staring at me strangely. There's a ghost in this house, the nurse declared, looking out of the window into the garden. As she spoke, the window suddenly opened, startling one of the maids into a shriek. Stop it! There's nobody here, the cook reassured them. Are you saying I lied about last night? The maid challenged. She continued, I won't stay here any longer. Tomorrow morning, I'm leaving. It's a good idea, the nurse agreed. Do you want to leave too? The maid asked the nurse. No, I need this job. I have to stay, the nurse replied. The cook went to the window, closed it firmly and said, We better go to sleep. The domestics retired to their rooms, but soon a scream echoed from another maid's room. They rushed to find her visibly shaken. "What happened?" the cook asked urgently. "I turned off the light and got into bed. Suddenly the light turned on and the curtain pulled back by itself," the maid explained, trembling. "I told you there's a ghost here," the nurse asserted. "You're probably just spooked from our conversation in the kitchen," the cook dismissed. "This house is perfectly safe. I don't believe in ghosts." "I'm certain there's a restless spirit here every night. I hear her voice every time," the nurse insisted before leaving the two maids alone. They exchanged worried glances. "I'm quitting tomorrow," one maid declared. That night, both maids heard the wail several times. Early the next morning, they gathered in the living room. One maid asked the other, "Did you see if she woke up?" "Yes, I saw her. She went to the living room," the other confirmed. They entered to find the young woman standing by the fireplace, gazing at her father's picture on the mantel. "Good morning, miss," one maid greeted hesitantly. The young woman didn't reply or even glance at them. "What do you want?" she asked curtly. "We've decided to quit our jobs," one maid announced. "No problem. I can pay you now." "Come back this weekend for your money," the young woman replied coolly. The maids accepted and left. An hour later, the young woman descended the stairs. The cook and nurse were busy with their tasks. "Please, ask one of the maids to bring my breakfast to my father's room," the young woman instructed the cook. The nurse and cook exchanged surprised looks before the cook responded. "But miss, they've left," the cook informed her. "They left? Where?" the young woman demanded. "They quit," the nurse clarified. "Then why didn't they tell me anything?" the young woman asked, puzzled. "They said they spoke to you about it this morning," the cook explained. "I saw nobody," she muttered, retreating back upstairs. "I told you something is wrong here. Her behavior is so odd," the nurse remarked to the cook. A few days passed peacefully until one day the cook received a letter. After reading it, she approached her employer, visibly agitated. "I need several days off," the cook requested. "Why? You know how much I need you here," the young woman inquired. "I received a letter from my sister. She's very ill and needs me. She has no one else to care for her, and she lives in another city. I must go to her," the cook explained urgently. The young woman smiled, got up and approached the cook. "Okay, get back here quickly when she's healed," she said warmly. Without wasting any time, the cook packed what she needed and left the house. As soon as the cook departed, the young woman entered the kitchen where the nurse was working. She stood watching the nurse for a moment before speaking. "It's just us here now," the young woman said. The nurse turned to her, curious. "I don't think you can manage all the household chores alone. I'll help you until the cook returns," the young woman offered. The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded gratefully. For hours they talked together, their conversation flowing into the evening. As dusk settled, the young woman suddenly announced, "I'm going to lock up the house now." "I'll come with you," the nurse said, a hint of unease in her voice. "Why?" the young woman asked, surprised. "I'm a bit scared to stay here alone," the nurse admitted, following the young woman towards the door. But as they approached, the nurse stopped abruptly and screamed. "Did you feel that?" she asked, trembling. The young woman stood frozen, her face drained of colour. After a moment she whispered, "A hand touched my shoulder." For several tense minutes they stood there, scanning the shadows. Finally, the young woman murmured, "Maybe we're just imagining things," and continued towards the door. Together, they locked up and went to their respective rooms. In the dead of night, the young woman was awakened by a woman's eerie wailing. Quietly slipping out of bed, she left her room and passed by the nurse's door. Pausing, she hesitated, then retraced her steps, turning on the light in the nurse's room. To her surprise, the nurse wasn't there. She noticed a picture on the small table and picked it up, finding a sentence written on the back. "What are you doing in my room?" The nurse's voice startled her from the doorframe. "I heard wailing. I thought you might have heard it too," the young woman explained. The nurse shook her head. "No, I didn't hear anything," she replied calmly. "Okay, sorry to disturb you," the young woman said awkwardly, retreating to her room. The next morning, the young woman left the house without notifying the nurse and didn't return until nightfall. As she entered, the house was eerily dark, suggesting the nurse had also left. Switching on the lights, she called out for the nurse, receiving no reply. Moving towards the staircase, she heard a sound behind her. Turning, she saw the large vase had been moved to the center of the salon. As she cautiously ascended the stairs, someone called her name. Startled, she turned and suddenly felt a force push her down the stairs. She tumbled, her vision spinning, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, as she heard the haunting wail of a woman close by. The nurse appeared beside her, still wailing. "Please help me," the young woman pleaded. The nurse leaned closer to her ear, continuing to wail, then abruptly stopped. "Why?" the young woman asked weakly. "That night, after my shift at the hospital, I was waiting at the bus stop when a car struck me," the nurse began, tears welling in her eyes. "I was nearly dead when I saw him, your father. He watched me impassively, then, finding no one around, he drove away, leaving me there. I wailed for help all night, but no one heard me. As I lost consciousness, I thought of my child and vowed to seek revenge." Tears streamed down the young woman's cheeks as the nurse picked up the fallen picture from the woman's handbag. Overwhelmed, the young woman closed her eyes and slipped into unconsciousness. When she woke the next day in the hospital, the cook was sitting beside her bed. "Thank goodness," the cook said with relief, rushing out to call a doctor. The young woman turned to look out the window and saw the picture beside her bed. The nurse, her child, and her sister.